Good afternoon. On behalf of General President Shapeberger, General Secretary Treasurer Kelly, I want to welcome all of you who are here in the room in Los Angeles and those also watching via the live stream to the 2019 Affiliate Leadership Training Summit. In this workshop on suicide prevention in the fire service. My name is Jim Brinkley and I'm the Director of Health and Safety for the IFF. As a former union president, I know very well the challenges that you face as affiliate leaders out there every day. And it's my job to help bring the tools and resources you need to keep your members healthy and safe. And I don't think there's a topic more critical to the fire service today than suicide and how we can prevent that, how we can keep our members healthy and safe on the job. We're always going to lose members during fire response. It's the nature of the business. But for me personally, having someone die by suicide is probably one of the most devastating things you'll ever have to deal with. And that's why we're here today. The presenters today are going to review with you what we know about suicide in the fire service, and more importantly, some of the things we don't know. We want to talk about suicide prevention, but we also want to talk about suicide postvention. And what does that mean? Postvention is really an organized response following a suicide to make sure we address the needs of those who are impacted most. Making sure that they heal, making sure they have the resources they need, and make sure that they're able to continue on the job. And most importantly, prevent suicide for those who are at the highest risk. We want to share with you what we know about prevention of suicide in the fire service and what the IFF is doing to address that. And what you, as an affiliate leader, can do when you leave here today to start making a difference. And we have two of the best presenters to address this topic today. I'm going to introduce them and I'm going to ask you to hold all questions until the end of the presentation. At that time, I'll come back to the stage and I'll ask you to go to the microphone so those watching at home will have the benefit of hearing the question and participating in the workshop. So let's start with introductions. I'm going to start with Brandon Dreeman. He's a captain and 17-year veteran of the Indianapolis Fire Department, and he also serves as the coordinator for firefighter wellness and support for his department. He travels across North America lecturing on first responder health and safety issues and establishing peer support programs. And he's also a master instructor with the IAFF Peer Support Training Program. Alongside him is Sarah Burns. She joined the IFF as a behavioral health specialist in January of 2018. Prior to that, she served as the director for suicide prevention at the Institute for Family Health, where she oversaw all activities related to suicide prevention, including training, technical assistance, research, and policy. At the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, she founded the Zero Suicide Institute to provide training and technical assistance to healthcare organizations striving to prevent suicide. She received her master's in public health from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Medicine and her master's in social work from the University of Maryland. Join me in welcoming Sarah and Brandon.
Thank you, Jim, and good afternoon and welcome. Connect with us via social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. The IFF main Twitter account is at IFF News Desk. You also have me at Sarah A. Burns and Brandon at B_Dreeman. If you're tweeting, and please feel free to do so throughout the presentation and throughout the rest of the conference, you can use the hashtags IFF, hashtag ALTS19, and hashtag SPSM, which stands for Suicide Prevention Social Media. The recording of this presentation, as Jim mentioned, this is being live broadcast to our affiliates all across the US and Canada, and the recording will be available after the presentation on the IFF Facebook pages and the YouTube page as well.
Okay, thank you for being here. I want to reiterate what Jim and Sarah said. This is an important topic, and I really appreciate having this group here and everyone tuning in as well. We have 4 big objectives with this presentation. The first is to broaden our understanding of what makes someone have a desire to die. What are the causes for suicide? We're going to get more education in that regard. That's going to be our prevention piece. Then we're going to examine the things we can do when we know somebody is having thoughts of suicide. Our third objective is that concept of postvention. When we have that suicide, how do we respond to that? And then our fourth objective is making sure that all of your questions are answered. So please, as Jim noted, write down your questions. At the end, you'll get a chance to ask them. Please take advantage of that. We want to be available to answer those questions. So as a starting point, I want to ask you all to do something. If you know a firefighter who has died by suicide, I want you to stand up. If you know a firefighter who has died by suicide, please stand. And look around the room a little bit. That's a pretty significant number of the people in here. So the second part to this is if you know more than one firefighter who has died by suicide, remain standing. All right, so again, we can see that, and we're going to talk about some numbers and statistics and things like that, but the bottom line, please be seated. Thank you very much. We can see that regardless of what those numbers are, this is a subject that touches a lot of us and has touched some of us multiple times. And that's really what we want to drive home as kind of a starting point here.
So as Brandon mentioned in the first part of the presentation, we're going to talk about different ways to understand suicide among firefighters. We're going to talk about risk and protective factors. We're going to talk about one theory of suicidal behavior and the mechanisms through which it might occur. And we're also going to look at the numbers. We're going to look at the data, both the national data and some of the firefighter-specific research to further understand the problem among our members. So let's start with risk factors. So what is a risk factor? A risk factor is a characteristic that makes it more likely that someone will die by suicide. These are things like having made a previous suicide attempt, the presence of mental health conditions or substance abuse problems, things like major losses. So for the fire service, this might be something like a loss of a relationship, like a divorce, but it could be a social loss, maybe a loss of social standing, or something like that. It could be a work or a financial loss. Maybe someone needs to retire or leave the fire service early due to injury. Or that could even be a retirement after a natural career in the fire service, that sense of a loss of identity when someone is no longer on the job in the way that they used to be. Another risk factor is exposure to trauma and a family history of suicide. In addition, having access to firearms or other lethal means of suicide is one of the biggest risk factors for suicide in the United States. So Brandon, these are the risk factors from the literature of the general population. I wonder, as a firefighter, what do you think about this list?
It's pretty good, and I think it has some relationship to unique factors for the fire service. We know that people who live in chronic pain or people who live with chronic injuries are at higher risk of suicide, and that's something that firefighters do a lot of with neck, back, hip, knee injuries, cancers, things like that. We live with a lot of pain. So I think that is kind of unique to us that we see that. One of the topics that you mentioned was exposure to trauma. That's among the general population that's a risk factor. Consider how often we're exposed to trauma and that cumulative effect over our careers, and I think that is also a unique risk that we face. Now, we're very resilient. Day in, day out, we do pretty well with that, but I think we have to recognize that that's also a risk factor. And then a third thing that I see is we are somewhat conditioned to face our own death. Part of our job, every time we go into that burning residence and we cross that threshold, we know in the back of our mind that could be a fatal act. Yet we do it anyway, and we do it aggressively, and we do it enthusiastically, knowing that it could kill us. So I think that ability to face our own mortality and act anyway is also a risk factor among the fire service population.
Right. And we know from the research that firefighters experience high rates of certain behavioral health disorders like PTSD, depression, and alcohol use disorder. So the risk factors gets a lot of attention. But just as important, if not more so, is the discussion around protective factors. So if a risk factor makes it more likely that someone will die by suicide, a protective factor makes it less likely. So let's look at some of these. Connectedness is a major protective factor. All kinds of connectedness to family, community, different social institutions, including the job, including the fire service. Good quality medical and mental health treatment is also a protective factor. The ability to adapt to change, which I think firefighters do generally very well, and problem-solving skills, in addition to having a sense of purpose or meaning. So Brandon, you reflected on risk factors. What are your reflections on unique protective factors for the fire service?
We have a lot of social support in the fire service. We have support with the crews we work with on our apparatus. We have support from the firehouse, the other people in the fire hall that we work with day in and day out. And sometimes those relationships are even stronger than our blood relationships. We're able to talk to our brothers and sisters about topics that maybe we're not comfortable talking with our spouses, our partners, and family members. So we have a unique bond there. We have the ability to talk about calls immediately after they happen, which is a great benefit to us. Going back to the firehouse after a bad call, we can discuss it. We can talk about those things at the kitchen table, which is another protective factor. We've seen a rise in peer support programs, so we know that we can talk to another firefighter. If we're having problems, we can do it in confidence, and we can get the help we need in a timely fashion. And we're also seeing a lot more education in recruit schools, officer candidate school, department-wide trainings, online and in person. This is a conversation that we're having more and more often. And as a result, we're normalizing discussions about behavioral health. For the people in our fire departments and our locals who have maybe had behavioral health problems, we're validating their experiences. We're letting them know that it's okay to have those issues and that help is available. So I think that normalizing and validating through all those social supports and education is tremendous protective factors for us.
So risk and protection is one way to look at the problem of suicide. Another way is to look to the theory. The interpersonal theory of suicide is just one theory of suicidal behavior and why it might occur. This theory has three constructs. You can see the three circles on the chart here. So the three constructs are thwarted belongingness, perceived burdensomeness, and the capability for suicide. If you look at the overlap of the two biggest circles, thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness, according to the theory, that's where desire for suicide comes in, from the overlap of those two things. But it's only when someone acquires the capability for suicide, that third circle, where the potential for lethal or nearly lethal self-injury occurs. So we're going to look at all three of these constructs in a little more detail.
So we'll start with the first big circle. And I love this theory because it's fairly simple to understand and it makes a lot of sense. When we look at thwarted belongingness, as human beings, we're social creatures. We have a need to belong. We have a need to connect with other people. And that in itself is a protective factor. For someone who may be considering, do I want to die, do I not want to die, having a family that's going to miss them, having children, having friends and coworkers who are going to be impacted by that can actually be a protective factor. However, it's possible that somebody can lose those social connections. And that's when we start having that feeling that I'm alone. And this starts to become dangerous when a couple of things happen. When we have feelings of disconnection along with an absence of reciprocal care. So what does that disconnection mean? What does it look like? The person who starts to isolate, we hear a lot of that, to be aware whenever somebody starts isolating behavior. And this is why. Because when people are separated, when they're not part of the group, they lose that connection. And having few social supports kind of turns that risk for suicide on its head, because now that person may think, if I die, nobody's really going to be affected by this because I don't have connections with anyone. Things that can make it better are marriages, strong marriages, having children, having those really strong connections that in some sense you have something to lose. Somebody's going to be hurt by your death. The pulling together is an important point, and there is actually some research done on suicide rates after national tragedies. In particular, the suicide rate after President Kennedy's assassination, after the Challenger explosion, and after 9/11. Immediately after those dates, the suicide rates were examined. And there was some thought that maybe the rates would go up, right? You have people who are already in trouble, they feel like they're not connected, and now this national tragedy piled on top of it. There was some expectation that they would go up. What the research revealed, though, was that suicide rates went down after those tragedies. And the people who did the research theorized that that's because when we have something like a national tragedy, people who felt disconnected before now suddenly feel like they're part of the larger group. It actually pulls us together and can act as a protective factor. The absence of reciprocal care is really a sense that I don't have anyone to care for me and I don't have anyone to care for. And that's what we mean by that absence of reciprocal care. But that takes care of that first big circle. When we look at the second circle, we're talking about burdensomeness. And we all have some desire to produce, particularly on this job. We want to feel like we're part of the solution. We want to know that we're helping out. And when we don't have that feeling, when we feel like we're not contributing, we can start feeling like we're a burden. And we can see this manifest itself again in two ways, through feelings of liability and feelings of self-hate. And with liability, I can use a couple of examples from the job. Let's say we all have this perception that we're only as strong as our weakest link. And that's true with our crews. And somebody who feels like they're that really weak link may look at their activities on the job and say, I'm holding my crew back. We can't be as aggressive as we need to be. We can't do the job the way we need to be able to do it because everybody always has to be watching out for me. As a result of that, we're not being as safe as we can be because we're not being efficient. And it doesn't matter where I go in the fire service, I'm always going to be that weak link, right? It's my fault. I just can't do the job. And then we can see that translate into home life, where that perception that I can't get anything right, I'm a burden to everybody, goes home. And that can lead to feelings of self-hate and blame. And when all that comes together, the person can start to believe that my death is worth more to the people around me than my life. And that's where that perceived burdensomeness becomes dangerous. So that kind of covers the two big circles. And I'm going to go back to the chart. If Sarah, you could explain again how it all comes together.
Thanks, Brandon. So we've looked at these two big circles and how thwarted belongingness can overlap and come together with perceived burdensomeness to create the desire for suicide in someone. But the desire for suicide is not enough for someone to die, because dying by suicide is not an easy thing to do. To die by suicide, someone must acquire the capability, this smaller third circle, to enact lethal self-injury and lose some of the fear that goes along with enacting suicidal behaviors. So Brandon, why don't you tell us about the capability for suicide?
Okay. So the desire to live is probably our most basic instinct, right? Being alive, our bodies go to a lot of trouble to keep us alive. If you just think touching a hot stove, before you can even think about it, your hand is pulled back. That's how strong the will to survive is. We don't even have to think about it. Our bodies do a lot of this for us. But we can reach that level if we have increased pain tolerance and a reduced fear of death. And we talked about this a little bit in the risk factors that are kind of unique to the fire service. If we look at that increased pain tolerance, that habituation to pain, long-term injuries, just doing the job itself is painful. Fighting fires in the winter, fighting fires in hot summers is painful. We get used to that. Working with injuries, we get used to that. We get habituated to that pain. Things like cancer, again, we see a lot of that in the fire service clearly, and that can be a habituation to pain as well. And then that reduced fear of death. We see tons of death. We see a lot of suicides. And again, under those risk factors, we're conditioned on a very real level to confront our own death and go ahead anyway. So in the fire service, we can reach these two things quicker than maybe we would like. But I do want to point out that this is often a very gradual process. Getting to the point to where you can commit a lethal self-act is a process. We've probably all jumped into a cold pool, and most people don't just run and jump into the cold pool. They walk up to it first and kind of examine whether or not they think it's cold. Then they put their foot in, right? Then maybe sit on the edge and put their legs in. And then if they're like me, go down the kiddie ladder into the short end until they get up to about their waist. And then you wait a little bit, take a couple deep breaths, and then you make the plunge. But it takes some working up to get that done. And sometimes this ability to commit a lethal self-act works the same way, where the person is saying, I have a desire to die, but I'm not sure how I want to do it. So they'll look at the means. What methods are available to do this? Then they'll decide a method and maybe get that method, buy it, and look at it, see how it works. Maybe do a couple of dry runs where they're sure it's not going to kill them, where they get up to their waist in it and try it on, so to speak. And then finally, after enough time, after enough acclimation, then they take the plunge and can commit the act. But this can be a very gradual process.
So we've looked at risk and protection as one way to understand and learn more about suicide. And we also just looked at one theory, the interpersonal theory of suicide, as another way to understand suicide. And the last way in this section that we're going to look at is the data. This chart shows the leading causes of death in the United States for 2016. It shows the top 10 leading causes of death broken out by age groups, and then all the way on the end for all ages. The boxes in blue are unintentional injuries. So you can see from ages 1 to 44, unintentional injury is the leading cause of death in the United States. The red boxes are homicide. So you can see that for younger people, homicide is still a leading cause of death. And finally, the green boxes are suicide. So suicide is the second leading cause of death for ages 10 to 44. You can see that suicide also appears as the fourth leading cause of death for ages 35 to 54. And the last column on the right, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States for all age groups. And in 2016, there were 44,945 Americans who died by suicide. So that's a big number, almost 45,000 Americans. But if you think about how big that actually is, how many people is 45,000 people? Well, 45,000 people is enough to fill the Staples Center down the street where the Lakers play twice. So we're talking about a lot of American lives here. And if we think about the research in Canada, for this same year, 2016, there were 3,926 Canadians who lost their lives to suicide.
So another graphic here just showing the United States. And this is a graphic showing the increase in suicide rates from 1999 to 2016. And in the United States, the suicide rate increased by 25.4% during that time period, which is a pretty significant increase. The darker the state, the higher the increase in the suicide rate. And as a side note that I think is interesting, the darkest states, the ones who saw the highest rates of increase, were also the states who began with the highest rates of suicide when this study was begun. So the states that started high remained having the highest rates of suicide throughout the study.
So we've looked at suicide as a leading cause of death in the United States and in Canada. We've looked at how suicide rates have been increasing in almost every state across the nation over the last 15 years or so. This slide shows suicide rates by age and sex in 2016. You can see that females are represented by the lighter blue and males are by the darker blue. This slide is showing suicide rates, so that's a number of deaths per 100,000 of that population. And you can see that males die by suicide far more often than females, and that middle-aged males or working-aged males have some of the highest suicide rates across the country. So let's look at, if we've talked about sex and we've talked about age, let's look at race. So this chart shows the rate of suicide by race for a 16-year period. And you can see, as Brandon mentioned from the map slide, that across the country, suicide rates have been increasing over this 16-year period. But you're also probably noticing that there are two lines toward the top of this graph. And if you can read it, you can tell that those are white Americans and American Indian and Alaska Natives. So the races with the highest rate of suicide in the United States are white and American Indian Alaska Natives.
So kind of drawing the last two slides together, what we can discern from that is that middle-aged white males are at a higher risk of suicide. When we look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they tell us that around 96% of professional firefighters are male, 82% of professional firefighters are white. And you can look around your own locals or in this room and see that a lot of us are in middle age. So when we really consider that, it's not terribly surprising that we see a fair amount of suicide in the fire service because we're made up of a demographic at higher risk for it. So on some level, that actually makes sense that we would see that. So with that in mind, We have to keep in mind that a lot of what you see in print media, on social media, about suicide rates in the fire service just isn't backed up by science. There are a lot of assumptions that go into a lot of this data. There are a lot of logical conclusions that are drawn, but logical conclusions are not scientific conclusions. And the IAFF is concerned about getting the science right because they want to make sure that they're using the right data. Can you tell us a little bit more about what we do and don't know regarding the statistics?
Yeah, first I want to underscore what Brandon said, that the IFF will always stick with the science. We will not move out ahead of the science, and we will always give you accurate information about all of the health and safety topics that we cover. So let's talk about what we don't know about firefighter suicide. The first thing that we don't know, and it might be the most important, is we don't know the rate of suicide among firefighters. And because we don't know this rate, we also don't know if firefighter suicide is increasing or decreasing over time. You can't make those comparisons statistically if you don't have the rate. You cannot just use raw numbers. We also don't know, because we don't have a rate, if firefighters are at a higher or lower risk of suicide than other groups that we might compare ourselves to. Those groups might be other first responders like law enforcement or members of the military. We cannot say if firefighters die by suicide at higher or lower rates than these other groups. A lot of what you see in trade publications or in the news media, print media, is trying to make comparisons among suicide or about suicide among firefighters to the general population. But as we know, firefighters on the whole don't look like the general population. Brandon gave us the statistics about the demographics of the fire service and what it looks like. So we really can't make comparisons among the fire service to the general population. And because the reason we don't know these things is because there is no national tracking system for firefighter suicides. And that's a big problem when you're trying to stick with the science. But it is a problem that might be solved soon. Last year in Congress, Representative Berra, the Democrat from California, introduced the HERO Act, or the Helping Emergency Responders Overcome Act. This bill does have to be reintroduced because we're in a new Congress this month, but the IFF's Department of Governmental Affairs is working with Representative Berra's office, and this bill will be reintroduced in the coming months in the House. This bill would help solve our data problem. It would require the Secretary of Health and Human Services to develop a national system to collect information on first responder suicide, and it would require an annual report to Congress, so that information in aggregate form would be made publicly available.
And the third part here is particularly exciting to me as a peer support instructor and as the coordinator of a program for my own department, that the HERO Act would also provide some grant funding. Anyone who has worked in this arena for very long at all knows that one of the biggest hurdles we face is getting money to start programs, getting money to train our people. And this would help offset some of that. So that's a really exciting part of this legislation to me. When we look at all the data, the things we've discussed so far, what we can really determine is that firefighters are resilient. And that's a really important point to drive home from all of this, is that we are very resilient. So the fact that firefighter suicide is happening at all is reason enough for the IAFF to get involved, and that's what they're doing with some new efforts.
Mm-hmm. The IFF doesn't need to wait for Congress to act or for anyone else to act, really, to better understand the problem of suicide among our members. And to that end, today I'm excited to announce that the IFF is creating a new online reporting system for member suicide deaths. So we will have better data from local union leaders like yourselves to the IFF central office about this problem. So this system will be online, and it'll be available to local union leaders. So when you log in, you'll be able to see every person who's ever been a member of your local. And that will allow you to report to the central office suicide deaths among members that have occurred in the past and those going forward that occur in the future. And we're interested in suicide deaths among current IFF members, but also former members. We wanted to make sure that we were including retirees in this. So it doesn't matter if someone is no longer a member of the IFF. If they die by suicide, we want to know. That's part of understanding the problem. Until this new system launches, if your local experiences a member death by suicide, let us know. Send me an email at behavioralhealth@iff.org. Let us know that the death occurred. And if you've experienced a death in the past, you can let us know that way as well.
And you may be asking, why, who cares? Why do we need to track this information? Is it really that important that we send Sarah that email for the time being? And it is very important for a couple of reasons. First, we want to actually know what the rate is. We want reliable information so we can make that determination. But this data will also tell the IAFF if more suicides are occurring in one area versus another. Is one method being used more often than another? And that information can help drive programming and support and trainings. So there is a real benefit to that. Also, in the postvention setting, which we've mentioned a couple of times, in the immediate aftermath of a firefighter suicide, if the IAFF can find out about that in a timely fashion, they can respond back to the locals and make sure that you have the resources you need to do effective postvention, which is critical to making sure that we get help to the people who need it and that we actually prevent further suicide.
So we're going to move into the second part of our presentation here, intervention. What do you do as a local union leader if one of your members is experiencing thoughts about suicide? We at the IFF want to make sure that every one of our brothers and sisters who experiences thoughts about suicide gets the help that they need and deserve. Suicide is a really complicated issue, as you know. It's not simply the result of stress or difficult life circumstances or one occurrence or event that happens in somebody's life. A major take-home point from this section that I want you to bring with you when you leave today is that mental health conditions, substance abuse problems, and suicidal ideations and behaviors are treatable. There are things we can do to help our members who are experiencing this.
So we're going to look at a few concepts that come up with suicide and suicide intervention that need to be addressed. The first is suicide is not selfish. I think sometimes, and I've heard it said, people will question, how could somebody die by suicide, leaving their family behind, leaving their friends, their coworkers? How could they do this to them to clean up that mess? But when we consider the interpersonal model that we've been looking at with the 3 circles, let's consider the state of mind of the person who dies by suicide. We're talking about someone who feels like they're not connected with the people around them. So in their mind, if I die, there's not going to be a real negative effect to it. People are not going to be negatively impacted by my death. If I feel like I'm a burden, not only do I feel like you're not going to be impacted by my death, you're actually going to benefit from it because you're not going to have to deal with me and my problems and take care of me anymore. That's actually a benefit to you, which is the opposite of being selfish, right? And we can also see that maybe with the long-term injured firefighter or the firefighter with cancer who's in agonizing pain, bedridden or home-ridden, being taken care of by family members, and they see the opportunities that that's costing their family. They see the financial burden on their families. So they say, you know what, I can end my pain and I can end their pain, and we're all going to be better off. So it's a benefit to them. And that can be difficult for us to wrap our minds around, and this is really key, we can't look at these issues from our perspective. Okay? We have to look at this issue from the perspective of the person who is suicidal. And until we make that effort to see things from their perspective, we're never really going to understand how best to prevent and intervene with suicidal people. And we're making great strides there, but the real key is to show that empathy, to try and understand things from their point of view. With that in mind, I'll also say suicide is not the easy way out. That's another thing that I've heard a number of times. Suicide's not easy. Sarah pointed that out earlier. This is a primal instinct. The suicide to suicide attempt ratio is about 1 suicide for every 20 attempts. Okay, 1 to 20. I would argue that if suicide was really that easy, if that was truly the easy way out, we would see a lot more suicides to attempts. The fact that it's 1 suicide for 20 attempts tells me it's pretty difficult to do. Dr. Thomas Joyner was one of the researchers who helped develop that interpersonal model. And he had this to say about suicide. said death by suicide requires staring the product of millions of years of evolution in the face and not blinking. It's tragic, fearsome, agonizing, and awful, but it is not easy. And I would definitely defer to his expert opinion in that regard.
Another thing to understand about suicide risk is that it changes really rapidly. In some sense, it can be like mood. We all have good days and bad days. People who experience suicidal thoughts and desires, some days they have more of those thoughts, and some days they have less. One of the key features of someone who's suicidal is ambivalence, not caring whether they live or die. And we know from the research that that ambivalence is present even at the moment when someone makes a suicide attempt. They can waver between not being sure whether life or death is the right path for them at that moment. There are many cases where people who have died by suicide have made concrete plans for the future. That earlier in the day they were planning to live. Something happened. The compounding of many factors coming together, and they die later.
If I could I have actually a story about that from a suicide we had in Indianapolis a number of years ago. This is a firefighter who was in treatment. He had a number of behavioral health disorders, including substance use disorder. He had been in treatment for about a year. He was back on the streets, back in the companies working, and everything seemed to be going as we would expect it to go. This was a good case by all accounts. And then I got the call one night that he had gone to a local bar and while out in the parking lot had killed himself, and totally caught me off guard. But that kind of demonstrates how whatever his acute trigger was, whatever that event that happened, changed his suicide risk quickly, and it escalated very rapidly before anybody could intervene. It also, his case speaks towards the ambivalence about dying. He was supposed to work the day after his suicide. And when people went to his home to go through his personal property, they discovered that his bag was packed and his uniform was ready for the next day. His meals were in the refrigerator, boxed up and ready to go. So at some point still on his 2 days off, he had every intention of going to work that next day. But whatever happened in between changed his risk, and he ended up dying as a result. But again, we can see both of those things in his case.
So firefighters, as we've said, are extremely resilient, and you deal with rapidly changing situations all the time. So dealing with a member who's at risk of suicide is no different in that regard. As union leaders, to help your members who are suicidal, you need to help them plan for if and when suicidal thoughts occur or reoccur. And we'll talk about some ways to do that now. So earlier we talked about risk factors for suicide. Now we're going to talk about warning signs. So what's the difference? Risk factors might be things in the background that make it more likely that someone is going to die by suicide, but warning signs indicate an immediate risk, that you need to do something immediately. If you notice any of these things we're going to talk about in your members, it's time to actively assess the person and get them to a behavioral health clinician for further assessment and possibly treatment. So we're going to talk about 3 categories of warning signs. The first category is verbal. So if you notice any of your members talking about wanting to kill themselves, I know this seems obvious, but talking about wanting to kill themselves or having no reason to live, feeling trapped or like they're a burden, take note of that. Don't just brush it off. You need to continue to talk to that person, and we'll talk more about how to do that in some later slides and get them to further help. So the next categories of warning signs are behavioral. So if you notice any of these things in your members, things like someone looking for ways to kill themselves, maybe doing searches online or purchasing a firearm, increasing the use of alcohol or drugs, or withdrawing. And what we're really talking about here is a change in their behavior. So a change in what's typical for that person before. And then if we look at the third category of warning signs, mood. A change in their mood, maybe being more anxious, more agitated, more angry than what's normal for that person. You need to do something about it. You need to ask them about it. So Brandon, why don't you talk to us a little bit about how you talk about suicide?
Okay, so we all know we come into this with certain risk factors. So picture that member of your local with those risk factors who is also exhibiting some of the warning signs that Sarah just described. And you're thinking to yourself, do I ask? Do I not ask? I don't know if I should bring this up. Let me just tell you, if your gut is saying I should ask about suicide, then you need to ask about suicide. And that bears repeating. If your gut is telling you to ask about suicide, then you need to ask about suicide, period. But how do we ask? What words do we use? And the little thought bubble up here tells you, are you having thoughts about killing yourself? Be simple, be direct. You're not going to put the idea in their head. I've heard that sometimes people are concerned about that. If I bring it up, am I going to put the idea in their head? Everybody out there has heard of suicide, all right? This is not going to be a new topic for these people. We're all aware it's out there. You're not going to put the idea in their head. I think sometimes we avoid asking the question, though, because we're really afraid we're going to get a yes. And when we're on the streets, when we're doing the job, it's not as difficult. Because we know if we reasonably believe somebody is suicidal, they're either going to go voluntarily or we'll get law enforcement involved. Somehow we're going to get them in to get that assessment. But for some reason with us, it feels different. And we're not real sure if I get that yes or that maybe, what do I do next? And I want everybody to take out their phone. If you don't have these numbers in there, I want you to do it now, please. This is a serious request. These are two numbers that you can use, one for the United States and one for Canada. If you ask somebody, are you having thoughts of killing yourself, and you get that yes, these are the numbers you can call. The first is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. That's for the United States. That number is 1-800-273-8255. 1-800-273-8255. If you're dealing with a military veteran, you can press option 1 and it will take you to a counselor who helps with veterans. For our Canadian brothers and sisters, the Canada Suicide Prevention Service. Number is 1-833-456-4566. 1-833-456-4566. These phone numbers are answered 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If it's a Tuesday at 2 in the morning on a national holiday, somebody is going to pick up that phone and give you help. They will talk to the person who is in crisis. They'll help get them out of crisis, come up with a safe plan, and they will also look in your area to see what crisis resources are available. In the United States, there's over 160 crisis centers that the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline looks up, and the Canada Suicide Prevention Service does a very similar thing. They look up crisis centers. Also keep in mind, it doesn't have to be somebody who's suicidal for them to help. Any type of emotional crisis, you can call that number and get help. So if you have a brother or sister who you are concerned about, whether it be suicide or any other emotional crisis, pull out your phone and hit that number. They'll be happy to talk to you. So please do that. That's one of the most important pieces of information you're going to walk out of here with today.
So we've talked about risk factors. We've talked about warning signs. We've talked about how you need to ask if a member is suicidal, if they've been exhibiting those warning signs, or if you have any other reason to believe that they might be suicidal. What you need to do next is help them reduce their access to lethal means about suicide. We know from the research that most people who make a non-fatal suicide attempt don't go on to die by suicide later. That's roughly 90%. So 90% of people who make a suicide attempt don't go on to die by suicide later. So what that suggests to us, if we can help them create a life that they feel is worth living, help them get through that acute crisis that they might be in, we've not only saved their life then, we've likely saved it for the long term and can help them really create the life that they want. Separating someone from the method they intend to use for suicide is highly effective. It's all about putting time and distance between someone who's suicidal and their chosen method of suicide. So I'm going to give you two examples from the research of how this works, and then Brandon's going to tell us a little bit more about how you can help do this as a union leader. So my first example comes from the Israeli Defense Force. Israel's a pretty small country, and they have a mandatory draft for all 18 to 21-year-olds. And because it's a small country, many of their soldiers go home on weekends, and they used to be able to take their weapons with them. In the first years of this study, 2003 to 2005, Israel in the Israeli Defense Force had about 28 suicides per year. Their leaders looked at the problem and implemented a policy solution in 2006. And this was a pretty simple policy change. All it said is when soldiers took leave on weekends, they could no longer take their weapons home with them, that they had to leave their firearms on base. Researchers compared the rate of suicide before the policy change and after the policy change. So in the latter years of the study, after this intervention, the suicide rate declined to about 16.5 suicides per year. That's a 40% decrease in suicide from one relatively small policy change that reduced the access to firearms among their soldiers. Most of this change was attributed to a decrease in firearm suicide over the weekends. So you might think that someone will just wait till Monday morning when they get back on post and have access to their gun. But actually, that's not the case. That's not what happened at all. There was no change in firearm suicide on weekdays. So people weren't just waiting until Monday. And the authors of this study did not find an increase in suicide by other means. So in this particular study, these soldiers were not just substituting one method for another. They weren't saying, oh, I don't have my gun, so I'll do something else. They just weren't making attempts, and therefore continued to live. So that's one example. Let's look at the next example. We're going to go from Israel to the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom was noticing increasing rates of self-poisonings with analgesics. So in 1998, they passed legislation that reduced the number of tablets of these medications that could be sold at a time. So pharmacies could only sell 32 tablets at a time of these medications, and other outlets like grocery stores could only sell 16 tablets at a time, where before there were no limits and someone could go in and buy as many of these pills as they wanted. So this study showed a 22% decrease in self-poisonings from these medications. What's interesting about this study is that ibuprofen overdoses, and ibuprofen was not included in this legislation, but ibuprofen overdoses increased slightly, but there was no effect on deaths because you're less likely to die from ibuprofen than from these classes of medications if you take an overdose. So with these two examples, I hope that I have showed you from the research that when lethal means are made less available or less deadly, that suicide rates by that method decline. And frequently, the overall suicide rate declines as well. So method substitution might occur in a small number of cases, but as long as the substituted method is less lethal, so from firearms to almost anything else except firearms, or from the analgesics I mentioned to something less lethal like ibuprofen, the person who makes an attempt is more likely to live. And as long as that person continues to live, we can intervene with them and help them create a life that they feel is worth living. So Brandon, how would we do this?
Okay, so Sarah gave us kind of a broad picture of how this can work. There's the poster, the graphic here is actually from gun shops in New Hampshire. They recognized that in the United States in particular, firearms are a commonly used method of dying by suicide. So they put up some posters that said, hey, if you're concerned about a friend or a family member, hold on to their guns. They recognize the lethality. They have a note on there about how lethal firearms are, about how prevalent access to firearms is. So even the gun shops got on board with this to say, if you're concerned about a family member or a friend, get them away from their guns. That makes sense. As a union leader, one of the keys about this is to let the person know that this is not punishment. Letting them know we want to get you away from the method that you've talked about using to kill yourself because we want to keep you safe. We're concerned about you, your family, your friends. Everybody's going to sleep better and feel better if we can get you away from those for a little while until we're sure you're better. We always want to ask about firearms. When the person is talking to us about suicide, they may tell us that they intend to overdose on painkillers. So we need to get the painkillers away from the person, but we also need to ask about, are there any guns in the house, or do you have access to guns? And that goes to what Sarah was talking about. in some limited cases, people will substitute a method. And if their method of substitution is firearm, it's even worse because it's a higher lethality. So always ask the person if they have access to guns. And don't leave it there. Find out from family members, from close friends, co-workers, who else can we involve, and ask them about firearms. Get people involved. As a union leader, you have a lot of other things to worry about besides this. You're not in the best position to keep track of this person to make sure that they're safe. So collaborate with the firefighter. Find out who else can we involve here that is close to you, can keep an eye on you to make sure we keep you separate from those means. And if things start going downhill, we can trust to call us or call the Suicide Prevention Lifeline to get you help. So involve those people in this discussion. Let them know that they're going to get their weapons back. They're going to get their pills back. They're going to get their knives back. Whatever it is that you're separating them from, let them know that this is temporary. You may get some pushback on firearms, and I've gotten it myself when I've had this conversation where the person will say, you know, I have the gun here for personal protection. If you pull that out of my house and somebody breaks in tonight to rob me, you're actually going to get me killed, which kind of defeats the purpose of all this, right? And you can just let the person know that, you know, realistically, the chance that tonight of all nights is the night somebody's going to break into your house to rob you is pretty much non-existent. I'm a lot more concerned about you using that firearm on yourself than I am that you're going to use it on a robber. Ideally, we want to get everything out of the house. That's the best separation. Sometimes that's not always possible. Sometimes people don't cooperate, which should really raise your level of suspicion. But ideally, we want to get the stuff out of the house, and we want to let them know again that this is not permanent. I really liken this to somebody who's had too much to drink. What do we do with that person? We take their keys, right? The car is a lethal means while they're intoxicated, so we separate them from that by taking their keys. This is really the same concept. We're just using it for suicide. We separate them from that lethal means. When a behavioral health professional says they're okay, they can have the stuff back, we give it back. But again, letting them know that it's not permanent is a good way to get some buy-in from them. Let them know that they can trust they're going to get their things back. Where can we learn how to have this conversation? The Suicide Prevention Resource Center has online training called Counseling on Access to Lethal Means, and it is great training. Everyone in this room, everyone watching this should take this training. It's free, it's fast, and it's online. There is no excuse not to have this training. No prior behavioral health experience is necessary, but this will teach you how to have those conversations. It will teach you what to look out for. It will teach you who else can we get involved. And you can go to go.edc, excuse me, go.edc.org/calmonline. You can log in, again, take the class for free. As Sarah mentioned, if we can separate somebody from their lethal means and we can stop that attempt, saving someone in the short run is more than likely going to save them in the long run. And that's why this is important. This training definitely saves lives. I've seen it save lives. So I encourage everybody here to take it.
In addition, you know, this isn't about violating someone's Second Amendment rights. This isn't about getting the police involved and those types of situations that you probably want to avoid. Helping one of your members reduce access to lethal means is really about keeping our brothers and sisters safe. And I think is totally within the realm of what we can do and help our members with if they're experiencing a suicidal crisis. So I mentioned at the beginning that there are treatments available. I want you to know that there are evidence-based treatments specifically for suicide. The old school way of thinking was that to prevent suicide or reduce somebody's suicidal behaviors was that you just needed to treat the underlying behavioral health disorder and then suicide would go away as an option for that person. We now know that that's not really the case. That in addition to treating a behavioral health disorder, we also have to treat suicide directly. And there are 3 or 4 evidence-based treatments that do that and have been demonstrated in the research to reduce suicide. And those are up here on the screen: dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, 2 types of cognitive behavioral therapy for suicide prevention, CTSP or brief CBT, and the collaborative assessment and management of suicidality, or CAMS. Most of these treatments can be relatively short term. CTSP is a 10-session intervention, and the research demonstrated a 50% reduction in suicide attempts after 10 sessions. BCBT demonstrated a 60% reduction in suicidal behaviors after 12 sessions. And the research on CAMS shows that it can reduce suicidal ideation and behaviors in as few as 6 to 8 sessions. So we can help our members overcome suicidal thoughts and behaviors with the proper treatment. So seek out mental health clinicians in your area, EAP providers or other people you contract with. Seek out people who use these therapies, advocate for them. Tell those folks that you want them to get this particular types of treatment, and you want them to be trained in how to treat your members using these modalities. Next resource is from the VA. And this is a resource for your mental health clinicians out there. So bring this home to your behavioral health specialists or people that you work with to refer your members to. Any provider who works with veterans in the United States, whether you work at the VA or not, your community provider, maybe you're in private practice, any provider who works with veterans can receive free consultation from the VA through the Rocky Mountain MIREX Suicide Risk Management Consultation Program. They call it their Never Worry Alone program. And clinicians can send an email to SRM for Suicide Risk Management, so srmconsult@va.gov. They'll ask some additional questions and schedule a time to talk via phone with that clinician to give them some extra support and consultation around working with a veteran who's experiencing suicidal thoughts.
So another great development from the VA's Rocky Mountain MIREC was a website that they developed to talk to children about suicide attempt of a family member or suicidal thoughts. And having this type of discussion with a kid is very difficult. Kids don't hear things the way we hear them. They don't process information the way we process it. And to make things even more complicated, depending on the age of the kid, they all process all that information differently within certain age groups. Recognizing that, the Rocky Mountain MIREC broke kids down into 3 groups: preschool, school age, and teenagers. And they developed a website that you can use as a union leader if you need to talk to a kid about a family member's suicide attempt or you need to refer a family to this information. You can go to their website and click on the age group that the kid is in. It'll take you to another page that will have written information as well as a video that will tell you how and when to talk to a kid about this subject matter. It will give you specific examples of things to do, specific examples of things to say to get the message across depending on the age group. What's even better with this is you don't have to be a VA member to use it. It's open to everybody. So go to the website now, check it out, see how it works now, and see all the resources that it has available on it, because it's really a tremendous website that we can use to talk to kids about this.
So I told you earlier about new IAFF efforts to understand suicide. Now I want to tell you about our new efforts to intervene when a member is suicidal. The IAFF has a new suicide prevention training that's under development. This is a collaboration and a partnership with Dr. Nathan Kimbrell at Duke University and Dr. Barbara Stanley at Columbia University, and is with funding from FEMA. The IAFF is creating a new evidence-based training on safety planning. Safety planning is one of the best available interventions. It's short-term, and it's really supported by the science. In one study, veterans who received a safety plan were half as likely to exhibit suicidal behavior and more than twice as likely to attend their mental health treatment appointments during the next 6 months than veterans who didn't receive a safety plan. So this training will be available for free and online to people who have gone through the IAFF peer support training already. And we're doing it this way so our members have better access to it. It's considered an advanced peer support intervention training program, which is why the 2-day peer support in-person training will be a prerequisite to take this suicide intervention skills training. We expect this training to be available next year.
Let's move on to the third objective here, and that is to discuss suicide postvention. The time to start thinking about this is now. In my work in peer support and behavioral health, I have seen the benefits that can come from this work. I know for a fact that I have worked with people who have told me they were suicidal, and we ended up getting them help and they got better. I'm sure we've intervened with people early enough that we got them help and they got better before they reached the level of suicidal thoughts. But even with all that, we're still going to have firefighter suicides, unfortunately. So prepare for that now, because there's a lot that can be gained from suicide postvention. We have 3 goals here. We want to make sure that the people most affected by the suicide get the help they need. There are other behavioral health problems that can stem for people who are close to the member who's died by suicide that we need to head off. And we can also prevent further suicide. It is a fact that good suicide postvention is good suicide prevention. The things that we're going to tell you that you can do and things you should do versus things you should not do are really important to preventing further suicides of our members in the aftermath of another suicide. Kind of some general principles. The first is treat a suicide death like other deaths. Don't avoid the family because you don't know what to say. Say what you would normally say. I'm sorry about your loss. You have our condolences. If you would normally send flowers to the family after a firefighter dies in a car accident, send flowers to the family after a firefighter dies by suicide. If you would normally send meals, send meals. By doing things, treating this the way you would treat any other firefighter death, it helps reduce some of the shame, the blame, the guilt, and the stigma that the family may be feeling. And that goes a long way towards good postvention and good prevention.
As we've talked about, suicide is just not the result of one factor. It's complex, and many, many factors contribute to somebody's death by suicide. So during your postvention efforts, don't oversimplify. Don't say that somebody died by suicide because they were disciplined on the job or because they were getting a divorce. That might be part of it, but there are so many more factors that go into a suicide than that. In addition, during your postvention efforts, avoid focusing too much on the method that they use to kill themselves. For most people, that information just isn't useful. And because it's not helpful, rather than focusing on how somebody died, we can focus on how they lived and really make a point to honor that person's life and not just reduce them to one detail of the method that they used.
And people are going to look to you as somebody they can trust. They may not look at the administration the same way that they look at their local, and more than likely they don't. Emphasize to them that help is available and that they can get it and that you can help them access that help. Because we want people to recognize that it's okay to have strong reactions to this, and if you need help, that you all are willing to get that for them because they're going to come to you as a trusted source to get that information.
So these are the tasks of postvention that we're going to talk about. We're going to go over each one in a little more detail. But the high-level overview, the brief version, is that when somebody dies and you think it's by suicide, you need to verify the details, coordinate your resources, figure out what's available to you and how you're going to deploy it to get to your members. You need to disseminate information. You have to communicate. I'm sure you went to many other sessions during this ALTS conference on communication. We need to be communicating about suicide just like any other issue we're facing. You need to identify the people who are likely to be the most impacted by this person's death, figure out what sort of help they need, and figure out the plan to get it for them. Of course, we need to commemorate the deceased person, like Brandon mentioned. And then finally, after you lose someone to suicide and you've gotten over the initial crisis, you need to think about enhancing your behavioral health programming overall. And we'll talk about how to do that.
Okay, so let's look at each one of these in turn, starting with verification of the death. There's any number of ways that you're going to find out that a member has died and that they've died by suicide. We need to very quickly figure out what we know and what we don't know, and you need to discuss that with the people in your organizations, the people in your local who you anticipate are going to be asked about this. We all know how quickly the rumor mill gets ramped up in our business, particularly with something like suicide. It's really important that we get a handle on what we know very quickly. So start considering now, who do you trust to give you accurate information? Do you have a public information officer? Do you have a good relationship with the municipality and their public information officer. That's who we use as a media resources officer, because we know that that person has contacts with all local media outlets. We know they have contacts in all local law enforcement, EMS, and fire services. And that person knows how to gather reliable information so that when it's passed on to us, we know it's accurate. Maybe you don't have that luxury in your areas to have a public information officer. If not, find out who you can trust and how you're going to verify this information, because it really is critical to put in the hammer on the rumor mill. More procedurally, if the death occurs in particular on union property, keep in mind that it will be treated like a crime scene. There's going to need to be a death investigation. Law enforcement will be involved. We just want to try and keep that as clear as we can so law enforcement can do their job. But again, that's fairly procedural, but certainly worth mentioning here. The next big thing is coordination of resources. Do you have an SOP that you can use for a firefighter suicide? Do you have an SOP that you can use for any firefighter death that you may be able to apply to this? Do you know whether you have any of those SOPs? Again, now is the time to find out. If you don't have anything in place or you want to learn more, I encourage you to go to the IAFF.org/behavioral health website. You scroll down to the bottom, there will be a link to model suicide postvention SOPs. You click that link, it'll take you to a page that actually has pre-written standard operating procedures that can be followed after a firefighter suicide. I know a department that has used these recently to great effect. So I encourage you, somebody's done the work. Don't reinvent the wheel. Go check this out. And it's a good way to find out what you need to be doing in the aftermath of a suicide so you can check your boxes and make sure you've got everything done. The next big issue is going to be resource management. A lot of people are going to reach out and they're going to want to help. There's going to be a lot of resources available to you, and trying to figure out what you can and can't use, should and shouldn't use, can be a bit of a challenge. These are just some of the things that may be available in your jurisdictions, but I would really point to that last one, the peer support team. This is when peer support can be really, really helpful. One of peer support's main jobs is to serve as the bridge between the firefighter in need of service and the services that are out there. Your peer support members know what services are available in your area. They know how to access those services. Let them deal with this. Keep in mind that your peer support team may be too close to this event to be useful. If they are, or you don't have a peer team, look to surrounding jurisdictions. Does somebody else have a peer team you can use? That's something we do in Indianapolis all the time. Smaller departments need assistance, we go help. That's what peer support teams want to do. So call on them to help you out with this. They can manage these resources probably better than you're going to be able to.
So you verified the details of the death, realized or determined that it is a suicide. You've looked at your policies and procedures for your department or your local to figure out what to do next, what you can do, what you can't do, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. You've assembled your resources. You've sort of started to figure out how members who will need help dealing with this incident can get it. Now you need to disseminate that information. You need to communicate it to all your members. And this will look different depending on the size of your local and what standard communication methods you used most often already. So you need to follow your existing procedures and your procedures for death notifications. So if you're a small local and you notify people via phone call and you create a phone tree, do it that way for a suicide death. If you have your peers go out and do station visits when you need to give challenging information to people, do that with this also. Like I mentioned before, avoid providing information about the method used. You've all been on really difficult calls, and if I mention a type of call, you can probably pull up a picture of it in your head immediately. And maybe you have a hard time getting rid of that picture in your head sometimes. We don't want to have that response with the image of one of our brothers and sisters, one of our friends and colleagues, and how they died by suicide. And if you provide too much information about the method somebody used to kill themselves, you're going to have that image with you, or you might, for a long time. So to get away from that issue, just don't provide information about the method used. It's not particularly helpful. You need to identify a media spokesperson. Like Brandon said, you might use the PIO from your department. If your labor management relations aren't the greatest, maybe you have your own media spokesperson after an incident like this. You also need to provide a written statement, and I'll give you an example of this. But you need to give information to your members and outside entities like the media, something in writing, so that you become the go-to source for information about this person's death and not somebody else. And you also need to notify the IAFF. Like we mentioned earlier, let your DVP know, let your state or provincial leaders know, and please let us know in the central office. Until our new suicide reporting system is up and running, if you experience a suicide death, send us an email, behavioralhealth@iff.org. So the next slide is an excellent example of a written statement following a suicide death. So your statements, you need to include factual information about the death. Don't say things that aren't true. Don't say things you can't back up. You need to be the go-to source for accurate, caring information about this situation. Because as Brandon mentioned, everybody's going to have an opinion and rumors can start really quickly. Your statement should also acknowledge that this death was a suicide. It's important to respect the family's wishes to protect the privacy of the deceased, but you also need to be realistic about how difficult it can be to keep something quiet. News travels really quickly, and it can discredit you as a union leader if all your members know that a death was a suicide, but you're not willing to say that and give accurate information about what happened and the resources available because of that. Your statement should offer condolences to family and friends, and it should also include concrete, detailed information about where someone can get help if they're having a rough time dealing with this person's death. You might want to put out two statements. One for the public that your media spokesperson can send out that has more generic information, and a separate statement for your members that includes really detailed information, your support numbers, your EAP numbers, your trusted clinicians, maybe something about your benefits and how many sessions somebody can go get with your health insurance plan to deal with grief and loss. Provide information about funeral plans so your members can go and grieve in ways that we would grieve for any other death of a member. And your public statement should include a media contact. If you do have two separate statements, your internal statement needs to direct members to direct all media inquiries to that person and ask your members, out of respect for the person's family, to not make statements to the media on their own. This is a resource for your media contacts or your PIOs. These are the recommendations for reporting on suicide. This is for members of the media, writers, editors, etc. We know that graphic, sensationalized, or romanticized depictions of suicide can contribute to contagion and in some cases facilitate further deaths by suicide. But we also know that the opposite is true, that media coverage that shows positive help-seeking behaviors can actually decrease further suicides. So provide these recommendations to reporters after a suicide death. They have a role to play in suicide prevention as well. They just might not know it yet. Media should also avoid oversimplifying the causes of suicide, like I mentioned earlier. And any news story about suicide, what we'd want to see is information about helpful resources. As a union leader, you'll provide these to your members, but the media should be providing them to the general public. Resources like the local crisis center or the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline that Brandon told us about earlier.
So the next step is to identify and support those people who need our help the most. Who is most likely to be impacted by the person's death? And there are three broad groups that we need to consider. The first, and probably most obvious, is the family, right? That member's family is our family, and we have to take care of them in the aftermath of this suicide. I recommend that you appoint somebody from your local to be a liaison to the family, somebody that they can trust. If they need to get information out, they can give it to one person, and that one person can get it to all the people who need it. Likewise, so that the family isn't being bombarded by questions and requests, it can go through that liaison. They can filter that information and get it to the family and take that burden off of them because they have enough to worry about. That liaison can also coordinate packing up the decedent's locker. This is something that we did in our most recent suicide that worked very well. And putting the decedent's personal items in boxes, not trash bags. Okay, that's a subtle point, but something to keep in mind. Put their things in boxes. We also made sure that there was a clean Class A uniform and that all the insignia were in the appropriate places. Family wasn't going to know where to put ribbons and things like that. We did. So we took care of that for them. They wanted the firefighters' gear displayed at the visitation. That's a pretty standard request. We can't take stinky, dirty, grimy gear into a funeral home and have it sitting there contaminating everything. So we took the gear, we got it to a washer, got it cleaned so that it was clean, decontaminated to be put out. But those are the little practical things we have to think about. And just asking the family, what do you need? Because a lot of times it's doing the laundry, it's making sure that they have meals, very practical things that family really need assistance with during this time. Maybe later on down the road when it really hits them what's happened, when they've had a chance to have lived through it and the phone calls and concerned people stop calling, that's when they might need more assistance from us on a behavioral health side. But right out of the gate, one of the best things a local can do is help them with the practical matters to get them through that next week to 2 weeks. The next group to consider are crew and close friends. And that can involve checking in with each member. And as a union leader, if you can do that, fantastic. I encourage you to do it. But I also encourage you, we've talked about peer support teams. This is another great time to use peer support. One of the things peer support teams do is they go out to the fire halls and the firehouses after a traumatic event and they talk to crews. And they can figure out who else may need help because it's probably not just going to be that crew, right? It's going to be maybe people who have been in recruit school with the person who's died. If the suicide was within your local, one of your other departments will have responded to that. They may need help. You may have members who have lost a family member to suicide. You may have members who have been suicidal themselves. That's one of the things peer support can go out when they talk to people and ask, who else do we need to be talking to? Help us out with this. Help us figure out where else we need to go. They're very good at that sort of thing. And you're going to have plenty to do helping to plan the funeral and make sure that that's all correct without having to worry about doing station visits and all of that. Use peer support for those things. And in a broader sense, all members are going to be impacted by this probably on some level. Anytime a brother or sister dies by suicide, we all feel it. Even when I read about one on Facebook or on Twitter, somebody I've never met in a city I've never been to, it still hits me a little bit because I know that person, right? We all know each other even if we've never met. So keep in mind that all of your members are going to be impacted by this. As a local, you can provide psychoeducation. It doesn't have to be complicated. It can be enough as to let people know that it's okay to have a strong response to this. Here are some resources that we trust. If you need help, you can reach out to them. If you need to talk, you can reach out to us as your local. We have your back. Let people know that they can come to you to get help. Let them know about coping, things like that. We'll talk about some good resource that's being developed now that you'll be able to use for that psychoeducation. But again, at some point, everybody within your organization needs to be contacted in some way about this suicide.
So let's talk about some additional resources to support the family of a member who dies by suicide. Don't worry about writing down these links. The full slide deck, including the links, is currently available on the IFF Frontline app. So you can download the slides and the handouts that we'll talk about later so you have access to these links in the future. So the first resource I want to mention is suicide bereavement support groups. There are support groups all across the US and Canada for people who've lost a loved one to suicide. You might consider providing this information to the family if one of your members dies. There are many organizations that track these groups and have listings, and the lists aren't all the same. So if you're looking for a support group in your area to recommend for the family, check all of the websites. The American Association of Suicidology and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention have listings for groups in both the United States and in Canada. The Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention, of course, has listings for groups in Canada. And Suicide Awareness Voices of Education has listings in the United States. Another great resource is the Survivor Outreach Program from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. What AFSP has done is taken people who've lost a loved one to suicide, train them to be outreach peers, and develop a web portal where anybody who's lost someone to suicide can go in and request an outreach visit. So you provide a little information about the loved one you lost, how long ago the suicide was, what your relationship was with that person, was it your child or your spouse, etc., and some other preferences about an outreach visit. If they have a trained outreach peer in your area, that person will go visit with the requester in person. If they don't have a trained outreach peer in your area, they'll still connect that person by phone or Skype, so they can do video chats. We know that peer support is really important. We know that in the fire service through the IFF's peer support training program, but we also know that it's important when dealing with particular issues. So we can connect the family with other people who've lost a loved one to suicide to help them process their grief.
So looking back at that triangle that we looked at just a little bit ago, that supporting all members, I think I had mentioned that you're going to be the trusted resource in all this. Some departments may have robust behavioral health programs where the membership trusts going to someone within the department for help, but a lot of places that's not the case. They may be afraid to go to their city or their township or whatever to get help because they're afraid maybe they'll be found unfit for duty, they're going to be put off work, whatever, they're not going to take that route. Who can they trust? Who has their back? Everybody in this room, that's who they trust. So as a union leader, let people know that you recognize this is a difficult time. Let them know that you care, that you're there. If they need help, they can turn to you and they can get help privately, confidentially, and care that you trust. Providing psychoeducation, we mentioned that. There are 3 emotions that we commonly see when someone has died by suicide. We see guilt, anger, and blame. Your membership is going to look back after that suicide and they're going to feel some guilt, more than likely. That person was isolating and I noticed it and I didn't say anything. Maybe if I would have just asked them how they were doing, they wouldn't be dead. They're going to feel guilt as a result of that. The person, I knew they hated guns, and they mentioned the other day that they bought a gun, and I didn't say anything. That was so out of the ordinary. What if I would have done something? We see blame and anger. Anger towards the person who's died. How could they do this? How could they leave us all behind to deal with this mess? And then blame. Maybe they blame the administration, right? If only would have had more resources available. If only we could have gotten that person time off work to get help, they'd still be alive. Let your membership know that it's normal to have those feelings and it's okay to have those feelings and they should be free to express them and work their way through it. I encourage you as part of that education, though, to give them examples of positive coping mechanisms and give them examples of coping mechanisms to avoid, like drinking and high-risk behaviors, things like that. But let them know that they can expect to feel these things and that help is out there, and ensuring them that getting that help is easy and confidential is a key. We know that stigma is a big concern in the fire service for reaching out for help. If they know they can trust you, they can get a resource that you would refer somebody to, that you trust, and they can do it quietly and confidentially, they're a lot more likely to reach out for help. And the earlier we get people help, the more we reduce the threat of further suicide. Step 5 is commemorating the deceased. Do this memorialization the way you would any other. Okay, we don't want to glorify the suicide. Sarah mentioned that. But we all recognize that the person is dead. The key is to recognize how the person lived. Make it a point that we're all here to carry on this job that we love so much after this person is gone. That's our responsibility, to take that going forward. As a local, we're going to do what we can to help people, and we're going to live the life that we need to live after this person's death. That's very life-affirming, and that's our goal. We don't want to focus on death, we want to focus on life. Keep in mind that certain times you need to prepare for. The anniversary date of that person's death, the person's birthday, can be highly triggering dates for people who are associated with that person. I encourage you As soon as you think about it, put it in your phone or whatever calendar system you have so that maybe a week before the anniversary date, you get a notice. And you can reach out to peer support and say, hey, this is coming up next week. How can we prepare for it? Get them on board to help you prepare for this. They can do the station visits. You can make the calls, however you decide to do it. But do it a week beforehand so that you have some idea that we need to start preparing for this.
Next step. So you've helped members to deal with the immediate aftermath of a suicide death. Now you need to turn your focus to beefing up your behavioral health programming. And actually, any union member, any local leader can take a look at these resources now. They're just great general resources out there on behavioral health in the fire service. So the first one, the IFF has an online behavioral health awareness course. This is a 2-hour course, free and online, and it's available to everybody, whether you're a union member or not. So you can have your chiefs take it, you can have your EAP providers take it. It's through the IFF website, Learning Management System, and you get a certificate when you complete it. Next excellent resource, we've mentioned peer support a number of times. The IFF has a 2-day in-person peer support training program. This program launched in 2016, and through the end of last year, through December 31st, 2018, we had delivered this training 122 times across the US and Canada. That works out to that we have trained more than 3,200 members in peer support. And they're out there doing the work every day in our locals across the US and Canada. 2 other great resources for you to check out. The WFI 4th edition has a chapter on behavioral health. It's chapter 5. And the NFPA 1500 Standard on Occupational Health and Safety Programs, chapter 12, specifically addresses behavioral health programs. So check out these resources now and look at them again if you experience a suicide death in the future, to think about how you can increase resources around behavioral health to be available for your members.
Another new effort from the IAFF is a handout on loss and grief, particular to suicide. That is actually available now. It's available today from the website. You can also get it off of your conference app. We've mentioned the psychoeducation component to this several times. This is a great resource to pull from for psychoeducation for your people. It's straightforward. It's great information. I've had the benefit of going through it and looking at it. You don't have to use the whole thing. It's a longer document, a couple pages. You can pick and choose what information you want to draw from. But again, a really great resource that somebody else is taking care of for you. It's available for free on the website or through your conference app. And it's not going to stop there. There are more handouts forthcoming that you're going to be able to draw from for education for your people. And you don't have to wait for that suicide, right? The time to start educating everyone is now, whether you've had a suicide or not. As the local, let people know that you're on board with this and you want them to get help. Some additional resources to talk about. I will cover them just very superficially, and then Sarah will get into them in a little more depth. Every state in the United States has a suicide prevention coordinator. Find out who that person is. That can be a great resource for you to know what's happening in your states regarding suicide and suicide prevention. I mentioned with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline and Canada Suicide Prevention Service that they refer to crisis centers. Where can we send people for help? You have the ability to locate where crisis centers are. Sarah will explain that a little bit. And then finally, the VA. We have a lot of veterans on the job. The VA has a lot of benefits and some people that can particularly help us with suicide prevention efforts.
So how do you find these people? And I'll tell you how to find each one of these resources. Don't wait until you experience a suicide death to find these resources in your local area. They can help you with all 3 points that we talked about today: suicide prevention, suicide intervention, and suicide postvention. Oftentimes, these people know where the local resources are. If you're looking for additional training and education on the issue of suicide, they're your ticket. They know where it is and who can provide additional training and information in your area. So the first one, as Brandon mentioned, every state has a state suicide prevention coordinator and a state suicide prevention strategy that aligns with our national strategy for suicide prevention. The Suicide Prevention Resource Center at sprc.org/states has their listings. You find the state, you can see the state plan, who the state coordinator is with their phone number and email address. Reach out to them, develop your connections ahead of time. Next one was your local crisis center. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline and Suicide Prevention Lifeline in Canada are all networks of the crisis centers across the country. So in the US, this is the map of where the crisis centers are. The US network has over 160 crisis centers that are linked together under that one national number. So these centers provide backup for one another, so the calls get answered. Calls never go to voicemail. You always get a live person. So you can find where the crisis center closest to you is by following these links for the US and for Canada. And finally, the Veterans Administration has really done a lot to prevent suicide. Every VA medical center across the country has a suicide prevention coordinator, and some of the larger medical centers have full teams of people that track high-risk veterans, provide them additional services, and provide suicide prevention training and information out in the community about veteran suicide prevention. It's totally within their mission to assist with the fire service, given the number of veterans we have on the job. So if you go to the website, you can put in your zip code or by state and filter by type of resource. You can see that I checked the box here for finding a suicide prevention coordinator. So I hope when you leave today, you're wondering what to do next. Finding these 3 resources in your area is one of the next steps that you should take in the next couple weeks.
That brings us to our 4th objective here, which is our question and answer session.
Yeah, excellent job, both of you. Look, this is a tough subject, and I know they shared a lot of information, but you're the ones that are on the front lines every day that have to deal with the issues that are impacting your members. So what information did we not share that you need answers on now? Please come up to the microphone so those who are viewing via the live stream have the ability to hear the questions, and we'll address them to the appropriate facilitator. But let me start. Sarah, I've been hearing a lot in my travels out and talking to the members that there's a sense out there that suicide in the fire service is increasing. Well, what do the numbers actually tell us? What do we know? And if we don't have those answers, what's the next step?
It's a really good question, Jim. Thanks for asking it. Like I mentioned, we don't know the rate of suicide among firefighters, so we can't say for sure whether it's increasing or decreasing over time. It might seem like firefighter suicide is increasing for a couple of reasons. One is we're more connected now than we used to be. Most times when a firefighter dies by suicide, it's splashed all over the news and on social media. So we might just be hearing about more suicide deaths now than we were in the past. It might seem like there are more firefighter suicides because, as we saw, the rate of suiciding in the United States increased by 25% over the last 15 years or so. So it might just be reflected in an increase in the general population. And another point to make is that the number of firefighters, professional firefighters in particular, in the United States has increased by over 100,000 in the past 10 or 15 years. So there are more professional firefighters now than there have ever been.
But we'll get a better idea of those numbers as we start to collect the data ourselves at the IFF.
Right.
Brandon, I want to send this next question to you. You mentioned the suicide that you suffered in Indianapolis, and you told a little bit of that story. Talk about the efforts the department took and the local took after that suicide so that you could help your members heal, and what was effective.
We made a few really critical changes. We used to follow a different model for our behavioral health program. We made a switch after that suicide to the peer support model. Originally, we were very reactive. Something terrible would happen, and we would send people out to get people together to talk about it. But it was always after something horrific had happened. We didn't do anything to front load that. And when we made the switch to peer support, we made education a priority. We made talking about this, making this an everyday conversation, one of the things we knew we had to do to normalize and validate what people were going through. We also took the time, before it was just go to EAP or go to the ER. And those weren't, for some people, those are great resources, but we needed more. We recognized we needed more than just EAP and ERs. So we started working with clinicians in our communities, Can you come to the fire station? We would love for you to work with us, but can you come and see what we do? Can we send our peer support members to your office to see what you do? Make sure we trust each other, make sure we're a good fit. So it was a lot of now preventative things that we're doing, as well as resource development that really made the difference. We're very fortunate we have total administrative buy-in for our program, which, that's not always the case, but if you can work towards that for our membership, that is so important that the local and management both recognize how important this is. We know that a top-down approach to behavioral health is way more effective than trying to build this from the bottom up.
And you bring up a great point. Many of the departments and the locals that I interact with, those who have the best resources, those who have the better programs and information, are those that have good labor management relationships. And that starts before the event actually happens. Now, when we started this workshop, Brandon asked all of you to stand up if you've encountered a suicide or you knew someone who died by suicide, and almost the entire room stood up. So I want to challenge you now, any one of you who stood up in the beginning of this workshop, come to the microphone. Tell us what has happened since that suicide in your department. How have things gotten better? Or what hasn't changed? What resources do you need? Because that's going to help us create the programs and the tools that you need. So I challenge any one of you to come to the microphone and tell us a little bit about the story of your department, your local, and what you're doing. And while I wait for someone to come up to the microphone for that, Sarah, timeline on the suicide reporting within the IFF. I know you're working with our information systems department. What kind of progress is being made so far?
Well, I think the biggest thing in terms of progress on all the issues dealing with suicide in the fire service is really the support from the General President. We have complete and total buy-in from General President Shapeberger to address this issue among our members. In terms of having this presentation, you heard him mention the problem of suicide in his address yesterday, and you're seeing all the things that we're doing to address this problem, even though the data isn't as good as we want it to be yet. I can guarantee that the new online suicide reporting system will launch before the Redmond Symposium later this year. I've had several meetings with top leadership and with the IT department to figure out the best ways to make it as easy as possible for you as local leaders to report a suicide death to us.
Critical for us to getting a better understanding of what's happening out there. So if you would please come to the microphone, your name and your local, and tell us a little bit about what your experience has been.
Eric Lynch, Lawrence, Kansas, local 1596. We had 2 members in 12 months take their lives by suicide. Well, I guess 1 local member, 1 department member on the chief level, so he wasn't a member. But so after the first death, we got with area departments, and the IFF sent 5 members initially to the 2-day course that the IFF offers. Had really good luck with it, had really good feedback, almost immediately started getting contacted by multiple members in the department right off the bat. After that, we just added, and now it's been about 18 months since we started the peer support team. We've added 6 more people, so 11 total. I think we've sent 8 of them to training so far from the IFF. Still waiting on 3 more. Leaning on area peer support teams. I've sent emails to several people that have taught on the IFF level. Him in particular. Having all those resources available at your fingertips is really invaluable. You can learn a lot, and you don't realize the type of issues that you have in your organization until these resources become available and start educating yourself on them. And then once you have those and you start to educate your own local, a lot of people start stepping forward, and you really kind of can start triaging yourself and start making a lot of positive influences. So.
Great job. That's a perfect example where you suffered a loss and you didn't just sit back and sulk about it. You took action, you got your members trained, you've stood up a program, and you're continuing to get others trained. Well done to you and the local leadership.
Thank you. I did have one question.
Sure.
About the IFF online reporting system that you guys are putting together. Are you worried about your data being incomplete or somewhat tainted by not looking at the entire nation, career and volunteer, that aren't locally recognized, by only looking at IFF members.
Well, Sarah always worries about data integrity, so I'm going to let her address that question.
Yes and no. You make a good point that to fully understand firefighter suicide across the nation, you do need to consider volunteers. But remember, this is the IFF. We represent you as professional firefighters, and it's within our mission to consider preventing and understanding suicide among our members. There are other organizations out there working on suicide prevention for the volunteer firefighters.
And we also understand, similar to all of the other occupational disease issues that we encounter, is the volunteer firefighters are a very different population than career firefighters. This is what we are doing for a living. This is where we spend the majority of our time, is responding to emergency calls, where the level of participation in volunteers varies greatly. They also have other occupational exposures, whether they're a plumber, a pipe fitter, boiler maker, any of those other occupations that contribute to their occupational illness. So we need to focus directly on what is happening with our members, because that's a better control group for us.
The other point to make on this is that one of the challenges with identifying the rate of suicide among firefighters is this point of the denominator. We need the numerator. We need to know how many people die by suicide, but we also have to know how many firefighters are in that group to begin with in order to calculate the rate. One of the strengths of the IFF with professional firefighters is our excellent membership department. Membership can tell us exactly how many professional firefighters, IFF members, we have at any given time going back decades. So by focusing just on our members, we're better able to calculate the rate to be able to make the comparisons year over year and to other groups like we talked about earlier.
Another question.
Good afternoon. Scott Ross, Local 1014. First of all, Brandon and Sarah, thank you for a very comprehensive overview of the suicide affecting our nation with firefighters. I have a question in regards, and I'm a peer lead for our department. I've been a peer supporter for 17 years. Unfortunately, with our department, we've had 8 to 10 suicides in the last 6 or 7 years. Several of those I know because I've been involved in each and every one of them. After the fact is that pain medication. We have a lot of firefighters off on injury. The pain medications that these people are getting through doctors with the high-risk suicide, you see it on TV, may elicit suicide thoughts. Is there any more awareness that we're doing as far as training and things like that for our folks that are dealing with that are off on injury? And I'll ask you to hold that answer for just a second, because I was actually had one of our members come up and talk to me in one of the trainings we were doing recently, and said that, and he comes from a firefighter family. His dad was a firefighter. He retired after a long career with the fire department. His father then committed suicide. His brother is on another department. And the member that approached me was on our department. And he said his brother had just come up to him recently in the last couple weeks. He was put on a high dose dose of prednisone for some kind of inner ear infection. He said that all of a sudden he had these incredible urges to commit suicide. He didn't understand it, and that the medication, if in fact that was what it was. But one of the things that he said is he now understands what happened to his dad, because that's the thing that we don't know, right? Why these people do that. So going back to that question with the pain medication and all those things, is there anything more that we can do with that?
Sarah, you want to take that one?
You want to go first?
I can speak to it a little, not so far as formal programming or anything like that, but one of the things that we do with our peer program is if we know somebody has been off work for 2 weeks, our peer team just reaches out to them and sees how they're doing. And we try and get some background on why they're off, what's going on, what do you need help with. And one of the things that we do watch for is, are they on those pain medications, that type of thing, because that is certainly a concern, not just with us, but obviously nationwide. And we can help address if there are, long-term use of narcotics, that type of thing. Again, and let me make it clear, peer supporters aren't clinicians, right? We're just firefighters, helping firefighters. But we can keep an eye on that sort of thing. And that's one of the things that we have made part of our program is that if you're off for 2 weeks, we check in with you. Again, we're being proactive rather than reactive. And that helps us keep an eye on that sort of thing a little bit closer than we've been able to in the past.
Very good, thank you. And also, I just got a text from my union president who is watching this live stream and texted a question, if I may. So he says, are there any suicidal tendency markers that can be detected in annual behavioral health exams proactively?
Really good question. So I'm going to answer both the questions. I'm going to add to what Brandon said, that the issue of pain medications and suicide risk will be addressed in the new IFF suicide intervention training on safety planning. We'll talk about how to have those conversations with members about reducing their access to pain medication. Not that we don't want you to have the medication you need to manage your pain. We just don't want you to have a lethal dose hanging around all the time. You know, go in your medicine cabinets, check and see what's there, what's expired, what you can get rid of. You know, if someone is experiencing really intense suicidal thoughts, you know, maybe a loved one can help them manage those medications, help dispense it to them, or maybe we can work with the prescriber and the insurance company to not mail them a 90-day supply all the time. You know, maybe we can have them get more frequent refills so they don't end up with this, you know, large cache of medication that they could take in a suicide attempt. To your second question, excellent question about annual medicals. If you have an annual medical, you should have a behavioral health component to it. You can use standard questionnaires, things like the Patient Health Questionnaire 9 for depression. Question number 9 in that asks about thoughts of hurting yourself or being better off dead in some way, gets at the suicide point. You should also be including questionnaires like the PCL5 to detect PTSD symptoms, and there are a couple of others. So yes, if you have an annual medical, look at getting behavioral health questions included in that.
And Sarah mentioned a couple of resources earlier, the WFI 4th edition and NFPA 1500, the health and safety standard. There's also another one, NFPA 1582, was the occupational medical program for the fire service. We're taking everything we're doing in behavioral health, from the online education to the peer support training to all of the suicide prevention items we've talked about here today, and we're codifying that in the codes and standards. So making it part of a requirement for all fire departments, or at least setting the gold standard for what every fire department should be doing. We have another question?
Peter Alexander, past president, Local 771, St. John, New Brunswick, Atlantic, Canada. I wanted to just share a couple of things with you that really wasn't hit on. One was, of course, that you did touch base on was the funeral services that we have. When we went through this a couple of times, just recently, just a year ago. And with our member, it came down to, and talking to the clinicians and the psychologists, is being very, very concerned of other members who suffered. So you talked about your overlap of feeling alone and
Come closer to the mic.
feeling alone and feeling abandoned and all these other things that our members are going through when they're thinking and contemplating suicide. One of the things is that I'm not worth anything. Nobody's going to remember me because I'm worthless, and all these really concerning things that go through their minds. And one of those is when you see us giving a full, so for a PTSD firefighter, we're saying, hey, this firefighter was injured, they took their life, we're going to give them all the full show, and rightfully so under certain circumstances. And we're all passionate about showing that honor to our brothers and our sisters. But what our psychologists talked to us about, and those clinicians in the team meeting that we had, was you got to be mindful of that, because you could actually make someone else say, well, maybe this is my time. They showed such an incredible show off, or a send off to Brother Joe. Maybe I can get the same thing. At least they'd have that. So we in our case, and again, it's a case per case thing, we sort of scaled it down in consultation with the family and all the factors and all the people. And I'll go to the second point, which makes this a little bit more complicated. And my second point being that you haven't talked about when a member not only takes their life, but their partner's life or someone else's life. That becomes a whole lot more complicated. So we had a member that was really a local hero, not just because he was a firefighter, but he was a hockey star, so he was very, very well known. His partner was a doctor who was very, very well known. So when that incident happened that he took her life, then his own, it became really challenging. Do you lower the flags? Don't you lower the flags?
Sure.
All the women's groups got involved, so we tried to be very proactive to sit with all the different women's groups, and the first time in 35 years since they had that executive board, they allowed a man in that room. That was myself. So we talked about that because we didn't want to show, in our respect to our brother who suffered from PTSD, that we knew about, was getting all the help and, the specialist and doing all the right things, or so we thought, and this end result still happened. We wanted to show him the care and the love, but we also had to be mindful, especially that it was such a big story, not just locally, but nationally, because he actually did it on the other side of the country.
Yeah,
So it
very,
just added to it.
very complicated situation,
Very,
and,
very
and
much.
let me break this down into a couple components. I'll let Sarah and Brandon address the romanticizing and making a martyr or a hero out of someone who dies by suicide. Let me talk more about the policy piece. So you heard Brandon and Sarah talk about you honor this death in any way, the same way you would any other firefighter death. And by that, I want to be clear. We're not saying every firefighter suicide is a line of duty death that deserves full honors. That's not what we're saying. We're saying if someone dies off duty in a car accident, you want to treat someone who dies off duty by suicide the same way.
Of course.
Is that suicide connected to the job? That's very complicated. Sarah mentioned this. There's usually not one right answer to that. The executive board policy is if they had diagnosed PTSD or mental health disorders connected to the job. And that's a loose interpretation as well, because how do you clearly connect it to the job? Yes, they have some grief, they have some trauma from being on the job, but there's also all kinds of factors that come into play in their personal life. But that's the policy side. So I'm going to turn it back to both of you on the romanticizing this or creating that hero aspect. I'm going to go out in a blaze of glory and get my honors. What do we know about that in the research, and what are some of the cautions we need to be aware of?
It's a good point to bring up. There is some concern about suicide contagion or of additional suicides occurring, after an event. But there's also a lot of concern about the stigma, prejudice, discrimination, the shame that a family feels losing a loved one. So I don't know that there's any one right answer. I'm not as concerned about suicide contagion among firefighters as I am in high school students, for example. A lot of the research and resources on suicide contagion are really aimed at school settings or younger ages, and there hasn't been a ton of work done, with working-aged males to see how big of a factor that is. So I'm not sure that there's one right answer. A lot of difficult situations, and as a union leader, you're always balancing multiple priorities to get the work done. Brandon, how have you guys dealt with suicide deaths and the funerals, the honors, those sorts of things?
We have, in our case, they've been off duty. They haven't been tied to anything job related, so we have treated them like other off-duty deaths. There are examples of firefighters who have died on station by suicide. That's, frankly, and I think the way that should be handled is the way you handled it, is you recognized this is an obvious issue. This is something we can't just jump and say this is how we're going to do it and that's that. You recognize that what parties are involved here. This is a sensitive subject. Are we able to sit down with them and have this discussion in a way that we can all come to a consensus that this is the way we should do it? It's not a sprint. We don't want to just jump to decisions. If, like you did, you recognize this, let's have a closed-door meeting and discuss it and come to a conclusion that we can all agree on. And I think in these cases, that's really all you can be expected to do.
Right, I would just only add a couple of more things. One of them was our media as well. We had a meeting with all media and said, look, at this community, this city is in trouble. They're all hurting, and this story can go a whole lot. And we want to respect all these plights out there of all the women's issues and that people are going through with abuse and all that kind of stuff. And we don't want to take away by giving a great send-off to our brother who passed and take away the value that a woman was killed, and very violently. So we had to respect that, and it almost tore our local, I mean, rephrase that. It caused a lot of grief within our local, because as gentlemen and ladies, they were like, abuse of a woman well, it's unspeakable. So a lot of our brothers went there, and others went, hey, he was a great guy, he was mentally ill. When you hit the lows and of the depths of depression, we don't know how deep that is. There's an abyss there that obviously caused the person not to be who they were. And I'm certainly not a clinician or an expert, but in my experience, it seems like there's a deep level there of how far people can go. And obviously, one can say that this gentleman went to a level that he acted in a way that he never was, because he was such cared about and he was such a kind person throughout his life, except for this one extraordinary, horrific act. So I just only stood to add that the example that when somebody else not just takes your own life, but you take another's, that's a whole other chapter in the approach that you good folks have talked about today. And I just end on this, is that we've been fortunate that we've had, EAP and the FAP and members who've helped our folks kind of before there was peer support. We've sort of had that in our local. But as a footnote, we actually took, and we were part of your peer support, and the story that I'm sharing with you literally took place a week after our peer support training. So it was sort of baptism in our fire. So don't hold off, do it now, and get your members trained. It's very important. So
Great message. You have a very complicated situation. Sounds like you handled it in a very thoughtful and caring way for all the different factions that were involved in here, dealing with multiple complicated issues. So well done to you and your executive team. We'll take one last question or comment, and we'll wrap this up.
I'm not this tall.
You won't hurt it. We'll let you. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Tara Hill, Kansas City, Missouri Fire Department, business agent with Local 42. We had Mesh Legio line of duty death in 2015. As a result from that, one of our firefighters committed suicide in the parking lot of one of our stations. Since then, Kansas City has been in a crisis, a true crisis. We have worked very hard on getting information out, beefing up our peer support. Eric Rose, who is our secretary-treasurer, has actually been appointed to the behavioral health by the general president. He's got disconnected with Valor, which does inpatient, where we're able to take our members outside of the emergency room, outside of EAP, just put them in the car, take them straight up, and get them the help that they need, which has been a very supportive program. We've also been able to get our insurance accepted up there as well for members who have related issues going on. So we're working on it. It's slow, it's sad, it hurts, and I'm really hoping that we can keep progressing forward. It's hard to see our members struggling as bad as they are, and to have to make that push because it's been ignored for so long. It's been called burnout, or just is there time to come off the job? But it's because they've got PTSD and they're suffering, and we've watched everybody do it for years, and that it takes an event like that to start actually opening people's eyes and to get you out there to get that drive to start protecting your members and taking care of your brothers and your sisters.
Right
Thank
on
you.
point. Thank you for sharing that. Look, I know Kansas City is hurting, but Local 42 is fighting back. You guys are tough. Tim Dupin, Eric Rose, we're meeting with them tomorrow to talk about continuing to build the behavioral health program there in Kansas City, and I have no doubt you guys are going to get back on your feet and get to a better place. I know that you also just recently got your insurance accepted at the IFF Center of Excellence, so your members can now come to our facility in Maryland as well. So another great resource. But there's a perfect example where you suffered a tragedy and you're just hoping to get past it, and it keeps compounding. And all you can do, it just keeps coming. But I know we've done multiple peer support training classes there. You have several members who are up to speed now, and we're going to continue to build on that program. So I'll be talking with Tim and team tomorrow to make sure that we get you what you need. Look, I want to wrap this up, but I just want to reiterate one thing that Brandon said there towards the end. Everything we teach at this conference, including the way we teach it and what's live streamed, all of the subjects are based on your evaluations. So aside from winning a nice Apple Watch, what I need you to do is complete those evaluations. Let us know what you liked and didn't like about this so that we can make it better for you. So when you spend your hard-earned union dollars to come to these conferences, you're getting the resources, tools, and education you need. And lastly, let's give a round of applause to two fantastic speakers, very knowledgeable on this subject.
Thank you.